Welcome to Early Matters, the podcast on the science and policy of early childhood, hosted by Dr. Katharine B. Stevens. Early Matters features in-depth conversations with leading researchers, practitioners, and policy experts on what matters most for young children and their families to thrive.
Welcome to another episode of Early Matters. I'm Katharine Stevens, your host and the founder and CEO of the Center on Child and Family Policy. I'm thrilled today to welcome Ivana Greco to Early Matters. Ivana's professional background is as an attorney. She graduated cum laude from Harvard Law School in 2011, and for a decade worked as a successful lawyer, specializing in qualified retirement plan advising and healthcare litigation. But just a couple of years ago, Ivana made an unusual life switch. She's now a stay-at-home mother of her 3 children, caring for a toddler and homeschooling her 2 young sons. She's also a wonderful writer, now publishing regularly on family policy and other issues that impact stay-at-home parents, including why she hates the term stay-at-home mom and what she thinks we should be calling parents who are caring for their children full-time instead. I am so excited to talk with her about all of this. Ivana, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. I'm honored to be on the podcast.
So your path from Harvard Law School to successful attorney to caring for and homeschooling your 3 children full-time is a fairly unusual one. Can you describe what you were doing before, what you're doing now, and talk about how this pretty major life change came about?
Certainly. So I graduated from Harvard Law School in 2011, and I clerked for a couple of years. And then I went to work at a local law firm here in Connecticut. And pretty soon after I began practicing law in a firm, I had my first child. And I loved practicing law. I loved the people I worked with. But right from the beginning, it was clear that it is very difficult to practice law full time and care for young children. And I had kind of additional difficulty in that my father is now passed, but my parents are aging, and there were some responsibilities there also. And so I actually did not practice law full-time. I practiced law in every iteration you can possibly imagine to make it work. I was full-time, I was part-time, I was an hourly basis, I was full-time again, I was part-time. I did it all to try to fit those things together. And I really wanted to make it work because I love the practice of law and I love the law. It's a wonderful profession, in my opinion, and it's a wonderful field.
So you had your first son. What year did you have your first son?
I had my first son in 2015.
And then you had a second child while you were still working. Is that right?
That's right, yes. So I had him in 2017. So there was never a point in which I was practicing law as a professional in which I did not have at least one child or one parent in need of some help. So I never had that experience of just working. I don't know that anybody does, but working without any personal responsibilities outside of my work. And during COVID, we just kind of hit a wall. My older son's school was closed. His kindergarten was on Zoom. And my younger son's daycare was closed for 8 months. And my husband and I just were really struggling and we couldn't make it work. And at the same time, I had always just missed my children terribly while I was working. I remember dropping my oldest son off at daycare for the first time, and this would have been in 2015. And I'd taken a long maternity leave, as my firm generously allowed, and he was 5 months old at the time. And I dropped him off at daycare for the first time, and I literally remember the sidewalks seeming to swim beneath my feet as I walked out of that daycare door.
Wow.
I just missed him. And, people at my office were very understanding. Women who had children said, it'll pass. It's just hormones. But it just never really passed. And I just missed my kids. And so during COVID, we had on the one hand this, like, we just can't make this work. We really want to try, but it's just not working. And then the other hand, me being like, and I just miss them so much. And finally we said, well, what are we doing? We can swing it on my husband's salary. What are we doing? And so in November of 2021, I gave notice at the firm and I said, that's it. I've really enjoyed working here, but I'm not going to come back from this. I'm going to be home with my kids. And it's the best thing I've ever done.
And during this period, you had a third child. Is that right?
I did, yeah. So in December 2022, I had a third child, a girl this time, and that has just been so special.
So you've been home with her full time, which is the first time you've been able to do that. Is that right?
That's right, yes. So my older two sons went to daycare at an early age, but she's not been in daycare.
And how has that been different for you and different for her, do you think?
So it has been much easier. It certainly has been much easier on me. I have obviously never had that experience of walking out of the daycare door and just being like, where's my baby? I miss my baby. And for her, and I do want to say, my older sons are fine. I don't think that daycare damaged them. And I would never sit in judgment on a woman or a family who puts their babies in daycare. Certainly not. But for her, I just think it's been so much smoother. My older sons, when they were in daycare, they always cried when I left them. And they often had all these colds. They were always sick. And we would come home and I'd be exhausted from working all day and they'd be tired from being in daycare all day. And so we might have like a good half an hour, 45 minutes to feed them dinner and get them in the tub and get them in bed. And that's just not my daughter's life at all. She's always with me and her brothers. She naps when she's tired. She eats dinner with the whole family. It's just not as rushed. It's not as hectic. And when I'm with her, I can really be with her instead of thinking about, oh, well, I have a filing deadline on Thursday and, this client really needs this email turned around as quick as possible. I don't have that constant mental chatter, which I'm sure you're familiar with, of a full-time job in the back of my head when I'm with her.
Right, exactly. So one of the things that I find so fascinating about what you've done is you've made this unusual life switch. I think there may be many people who think about doing it, who want to do it, but don't. And you've also been reflecting on it and writing about it, both in terms of your own experience and in a broader sense, kind of how we think about these issues in our society. And I think you bring such a valuable voice due to that combination. One thing I find fascinating in your work is you've written that you hate the term stay-at-home mom to describe women who are caring for their children full time rather than participating in the workforce. Why do you think that's the wrong term? And what do you think we should be using instead?
So I hate the term stay-at-home mom. It's a pretty modern term, and it's not really clear where it came from. But anyway, it really implies that women who are at home with their children, that all they do is stay home, that they have no productive life. They're just sort of locked behind the doors of their homes and, who knows what happens there, nothing very useful. And so I think it's a term that really degrades the value of what mothers at home are doing. And so I much prefer the term homemaker because it does encapsulate that you are making something when you are home. You're not sort of a leech on the economy, which unfortunately is too often how mothers at home are described. You are creating something at home.
So you've written about the range of roles that you see homemakers playing that the term stay-at-home mom does not capture. Can you talk a little bit about that idea?
Definitely. So women who are homemakers in the United States have just been fundamental to how our country functions from the very beginning. So homemaking women literally spun the cloth that clothed the Continental Army. Abigail Adams, who described herself primarily as a housewife, was tremendously important in shaping the philosophy of our young country. And it just goes on from there, from that auspicious beginning. So homemakers were very important in the anti-slavery movement. They were very important in the temperance movement, very important in the women's rights movement. And so women who are at home have never just been focused on their own children and their husbands and their own households, although, of course, those are very important. Historically, they've played a tremendous role in community engagement, in charitable organizations. They have used their time, particularly as their children got older, in these immensely valuable ways to tie communities together. And others have written about this. When women left the workforce in large numbers, that role that women used to play essentially disappeared. So that important work is largely taken up now by professional nonprofits. And I don't think we really understand what an impact that switch has had. The professionalization of a lot of charitable and community building work.
So, as you know, there are, broadly speaking, two main arguments for why paid non-parental care is so important with respect to women who are most often the primary caregivers. The first argument is they're needed in the workforce. So businesses have the skilled workforce they and the country need, and the economy can grow. When they're not in the workforce, there have been a number of studies showing it's very costly at local, state, and federal levels. The federal government recently cited a BCG analysis, for example, showing upcoming GDP losses of 290 billion per year if the US fails to put subsidized or universal childcare in place. So that's the first argument, the economy, GDP argument. The second argument is that women want to be moving forward, not backwards, which means increasing their earnings and building a rewarding career. There was an article that came out just a few months ago in Bloomberg. US women miss out on 627 billion a year by not getting paid for caregiving. So I want to ask you about both of those, starting with the first one, this focus on the need for women to be in the workforce. And you've argued that there's a kind of a false dichotomy, actually, between a pro-GDP position and a pro-family position that is more likely to be supporting a caretaker parent at home. What are your thoughts on all that?
Sure. So I actually think that both questions stem from the same fundamental misunderstanding, which is that GDP growth and salary are the only way to measure the worth of what someone does. So I actually think both those questions have the same root problem. So to start with GDP growth, it is true that the work women do in the workforce is immensely valuable. And to be clear, I think it's great that women have those opportunities today. That is amazing. That is a very needed change. However, I do think that along with that push that women should be able to join the workforce, there has been a devaluation of what women used to do at home. And so the GDP is a great metric, but it is only a metric. It does not capture the full worth of what is produced in society. And so the best example I have of this, and it's certainly not original to me, but if a woman cares for her child at home, that is not reflected in the GDP. That metric does not pick that up. If she cares for her neighbor's child and her neighbor's cares for her child, that is reflected in the GDP. And so that second scenario is classified as economic growth, and the first one is not. That's obviously absurd, right? Like, why should my swapping children with my neighbor create GDP growth and my caring for my own child not be valued at all? So I think that this emphasis on GDP growth, while it's a great metric, just totally misses the value of what women historically have done at home, which is immensely valuable. And in fact, when economists try to correct for this, they have to revise GDP growth to account for unpaid household labor. And presently, we've just sort of lost that. And in addition to that, I don't know how you value a happy childhood. Like, I don't know how you value a baby who is warmly connected to his or her mother, who has a pleasant, easy baby life. I don't know how you put a number on that. I don't think you can. But at any rate, GDP is not picking that up. And that is one of the most important services that a homemaking mother with a young baby provides to her family and to society at large.
So the second argument, which is kind of more at a personal fulfillment rates level, that women have gained so much. They have advanced education, they have careers, they have higher earnings, as in fact you yourself did. For example, a columnist at CNN recently wrote that public policy that incentivizes women to become homemakers is bad for women because it damages their financial prospects, which is widely described as the quote motherhood penalty. And also that it, quote, further entrenches the very things that make so many stay at home moms so miserable. The isolated nuclear family with the mother home with the kids all day, men who don't do their fair share, and a society that pushes its collective care burdens off on individual women. How do you respond to those ideas, that argument?
So I'm familiar with that article. And what I would say in response to that, so I've graduated from Harvard Law School. I'm very familiar with the mentality that is like, the most important thing you can do is achieve the next gold ring. That first you go to a great college, and then you go to a great graduate school, and then you go and you make partner, or you become an attending physician. I'm very familiar with you must always be striving to achieve the next professional goal, and that is how you find fulfillment and happiness in life. And I just reject that mentality entirely. I don't think there's anything wrong with it, but I also very much do not think it is a straight arrow to a happy life. I know many law firm partners who are utterly miserable. I know many attending physicians who are utterly miserable. I mean, that's not all of them, but that's certainly, that is not a straight arrow to a happy life, in my view. So that said, I do think that there are very important roles for governments, both state and federal governments, to play in protecting homemakers. And I write about that. I do think it's very important that we have a generous social safety net for the people who have decided to dedicate themselves to their families. But simultaneously, I reject the mentality that is the only worth a woman has is out in the paid workforce, and the work she does at home is not worthwhile or fulfilling. I think that is just an utterly wrong mentality. It stems from sort of fetishization of the only worth a person has is how much money they make. And I don't think reasonable people need to agree with that.
You've also been looking at survey research on this question. What do you think survey research is telling us about more general ideas about this?
So when you look at the surveys, you see that the only people in society who want to have two full-time careers is college-educated wealthy people. That is the segment of society who really wants to have both parents in the paid workforce. For almost everybody else, on average, of course, individuals vary, but on average, what they would like to have is their children cared for at home, either by the mother or by extended family, or sometimes by dad. Family circumstances differ. So for most Americans, what they would like is not to have their children in paid childcare, but rather at home with mom, probably dad or grandma or grandpa. Despite that, much of our childcare policy is focused on what wealthy, educated people want, which is to have an expansion of paid childcare and for both parents working. So I suppose it's not surprising that these elite preferences are so shaping our childcare debate, but I do think it's deeply misguided because it ignores what most Americans want, which is for their babies and toddlers to be home instead of in outside daycares.
Another question that people ask is, what you're arguing is that this kind of caregiving work is extremely valuable. If that's true, shouldn't it be compensated? Is it fair for people to be doing this work unpaid?
Well, like I said, I do argue in favor of generous social safety nets for homemakers. So I agree that being a homemaker can leave you financially vulnerable. And so we should do what we can to prevent that. However, to the extent that we're saying that any mother who's home needs to receive a paycheck from the federal government, I find that weird. And I don't have a better way to explain it than that. But I've talked to other friends who are homemakers about this, discussing, like, would you want the federal government to pay you for taking care of your own children? And by and large, the answer is like, no, that's kind of creepy. Most people would not, I guess, reject money. But the idea that any work that's done that's valuable should receive a paycheck from someone is just kind of a weird one when you think about it. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't provide government support for families that need it. Certainly, I'm not saying that. But for example, I helped take care of my father when he was dying of cancer. I think that was also very important work. Would I say that I need to receive some sort of paycheck to compensate for the work that I did? I don't have a better way to explain it other than some human relationships are so fundamental to who you are that its importance does not depend upon receiving a paycheck from somebody. And so taking care of my children is so, and every parent takes care of their children. So I'm not saying that, but taking care of my children in a hands-on way at this stage in their life is so fundamental to me that its importance does not depend upon the federal government or, God forbid, my husband writing me a check to do it.
So with this narrative that is really quite prominent these days, that this CNN columnist was referring to, that mothers who are at home full-time caring for their children are miserable, that they feel isolated, unfulfilled, and trapped. What are your thoughts on that?
So I'm not familiar with what statistics she is depending upon to reach that conclusion. So I can't speak to that. But I will say, personally, for me, I have done document review 12 hours a day, and I have cared for babies and toddlers 12 hours. Well, not just 12 hours a day, but, eliminating sleep as a time in which you're taking care of them. So I have done both those things, right? I have done hours and hours and hours and days of document review and hours and hours and hours of days and days of caring for babies and toddlers. And I will say that caring for the babies and toddlers is more fun. So I think that there's this weird sense that all jobs are immensely fulfilling all the time, and maybe CNN columnist is one of them. But for most people, jobs entail a fair amount of drudgery. Taking care of kids also involves a fair amount of drudgery, to be honest. You got to change diapers, you have to deal with temper tantrums, and so on and so forth. But I think it is very weird to be like, the paid workforce is amazing, it is fulfilling, it offers a path to self-actualization, where for most people with real jobs, work's good because it gives you money, but it's not actually like fundamental to your sense of self. Whereas taking care of your kids can be deeply fulfilling. And, is every day-to-day moment amazing? It is not. Like making dinner while one of your kids is melting down and the baby has a poopy diaper, that's not the best, to be sure. But no matter what you do, you're in for work and unpleasantness and difficulty in life. That's just a given, right? But taking care of your kids actually can be really meaningful, really fulfilling, and something you can look back upon and say, I did a really good job at that. I did my best. I put my whole into that. And that was really meaningful.
So it strikes me, Ivana, that one thing that may go into this feeling miserable narrative is the fact that if you are a lawyer, a successful lawyer at a good firm, in practice, that may involve an equal or greater amount of drudgery. In practice, it may be equally or less fulfilling. But in terms of the way society sees you, when you're at a dinner party and somebody asks you what you do, and I'm wondering to what extent it's oppressive actually to women, even if they are inclined to feel as though taking care of their children in the way you've been describing is fulfilling and worthwhile. It's just uncomfortable to be doing something that the rest of the society sees as lame. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I can tell the difference when I'm at dinner parties and I introduce myself as a homemaker versus when I introduced myself as a lawyer. People just take you less seriously, and that's a fact of life. And you can not like it, but that is the way things go. So I would like there to be social change on that. I think that for whatever reason in the 60s and 70s, when women started on a large scale engaging in paid work, that went along with a devaluation of work at home. So it was sort of seen that technological advancement and economic advancement rendered the work that women used to do at home worthless or unnecessary or duplicative. It was sort of a lifestyle choice to stay home rather than engaging in needed and valuable paid work. And Betty Friedan writes about this. She talks about how with modern grocery stores and the modern school system and modern specialization of labor, women just were not needed at home. And so we developed this sense as a society that it is superfluous for women to be at home. But in 2024, I just do not know how you look at rates of childhood depression, at rates of childhood obesity, at rates of children's educational attainment, and think that there is no work for mothers to do at home that is important. I don't know how you look at how few families eat dinner together around the dinner table anymore and think we didn't lose something that mattered a lot. And so we thought that grocery stores and cleaning services would just replace this important role. But as it turns out, you can't. I don't want to say that some people don't make it work. Some people definitely do make it work. But for a lot of families, they're really suffering because they don't have time to eat dinner together as a family. They don't have time to sit with a child who's struggling in reading and put in the hours that it takes to read those early readers together. And so we put all this pressure now on daycares and schools and mental health professionals to, I'm making air quotes now, to fix children. But there used to be someone whose role it was to do that, to support a child throughout their childhood. And that was the mother. And don't think it is so easy to replace her, as we have concluded.
So, another question that I have, there's a group of people who argue that this is work uniquely done by women and that it's important that women are the ones doing it. There is an opposing group that argues that this sort of discussion that we're having is fundamentally trying to get women, back barefoot and pregnant behind white picket fences. And what's missing on both sides of that are men, our fathers. What are your thoughts on that picture?
So I do agree that fathers play a tremendously important role in the raising of their children. I think a role that has been devalued for a long time. So I should say that I completely agree on that. Dads are very important. And the old model we had of dads providing nothing more than a paycheck to the raising of children, I think was very misguided. I also, as I've said, I think that women's attainments in the workforce and in education are amazing. They're needed. There are so many women who play incredibly critical roles in the economy and in society professionally today. And we would be a much poorer, I don't mean just like in terms of money, we'd be a much poorer society without them. However, again, what I would say is that recognizing that does not mean devaluing the work that women do at home. I actually think that it is feminist, it is pro-women to say that women have a very special and important role to play when it comes to children. That doesn't mean that some families wouldn't be better off with a stay-at-home dad. Each family is different. That doesn't mean that dads don't have critical and important roles to play. But just in terms of when you think about, okay, who gestates the child, who nurses the child, just biologically, there is a really important role for mothers to play in the care of young children. My husband is wonderful. He's a wonderful, engaged dad. He cannot get up and nurse the baby at 3 a.m. And let me tell you, it is a lot easier to get up and nurse the baby at 3 a.m. when you are not then getting up again at 6:30 a.m. to get the kids ready for daycare and then drive to work and have a long argument with opposing counsel about document discovery. Somehow we just have thought being a mother to a young child is something that can be done in the margins of your day, but it is actually a very difficult and demanding job to do. And it is very hard to square with another difficult and demanding job.
So another dimension of this, there's an argument that has been emerging fairly recently with respect to children, which is that many parents are not necessarily capable of providing the kind of high quality early learning environment that young children need to develop, and that in fact, children benefit from being in early care and education environments with professionals who are trained and are providing them with a learning environment that many parents just aren't really capable of doing. What do you think about that?
I think that is insane and dystopian. I'm familiar with this argument, and I think that it is crazy. So I think if you are talking about a 3-year-old who you've gone and put in preschool, can you teach that 3-year-old the ABCs quicker than that 3-year-old might learn at home? Totally possible. If you're just focusing on teaching that 3-year-old to learn their ABCs, when you test them at 4, can you do better than a mom at home with her kids? Sure, possibly. But you've missed out on the fact that the ABCs are not all there is to life. And so when we talk about a child's ability to learn, I think we need to take a much broader perspective than school readiness, which is the metric that a lot of early child care experts focus on. And other things that we could think about is that child warmly integrated into his or her family? What are the relational bonds that that child has with his or her older siblings? What are the relational bonds that the child has with his or her grandparents? Does the child understand patience? Has the child been taught that your older brother or sister is somebody to love, and sometimes you wait for them to get what they need, and sometimes they wait for you to get what you need? Has the child been taught to participate in family life? You know, even a 3-year-old can bring napkins to the table to help set the table. These are all incredibly important life lessons that are, I'd say, probably most easily learned at home. They can be attempted to be taught in preschool, but I think that's sort of like a second best to home life. The other thing I'd say is there's this vision that we are going to create high quality childcare for every child in the United States. I don't know where this is going to come from. You know, when we look at childcare right now, most childcare centers are not high quality. I sent my children to daycare, and I think it was a pretty high quality daycare. And I remember taking my oldest son, who was a year and a half at the time, home from daycare one day and taking off his shirt to give him a tub. And I saw a perfect tooth imprint, like a full mouse imprint on his back. Another 1.5-year-old had clearly reached over and bitten him on his back. And, the daycare didn't mention it. So I just find it ridiculous that we have this sense that a daycare that might have, I think at best, 8 children in a classroom with 2 providers is better than a child at home in a loving family. Certainly, there are exceptions at the margins. Certainly, and I think the studies back this up, when you talk about families in significant dysfunction, in significant poverty, who are really struggling to take care of their children at home, would those specific children be better off in some sort of outside childcare? It's possible, although my first instinct would be, well, how can we support these families better rather than essentially taking their kids away from them? But certainly you'll see examples at the margins that will be contrary to this. But I think the idea that at only a couple months old, would a child be better off in some sort of early learning center so we can, get those ABCs in as quickly as possible, I think that idea is nuts.
So, you've also been writing about policy solutions, ways that we can change policy that do a better job of incorporating this kind of work into our system. What are some of the ideas that you think make sense?
So I mainly write about how we can better support the homemakers themselves. So most of the ideas that I've written about are how we can better expand social safety nets to protect the women and men who have become homemakers. So, for example, I think the Social Security program needs significant revamping to take into account how modern homemakers operate. So it used to be that homemakers never held a job at all and got to retirement age without any workforce participation. That is not the case anymore. Most homemakers these days go in and out of the workforce, or they earn a little money. Almost all of the time they engage in some paid work. And so our Social Security credit system is not well set up to handle that. So that is one example of an area I think that needs reform. Another area that I think needs reform is stay-at-home moms who want to re-enter the workforce after their children are older could use some help. So I do think it's important that employers look out for homemakers and provide on-ramps back into the workforce. I think there's a lot of work that professional credentialing organizations could do to ease return to paid work for people who have been home with their kids. And here, I think it's important to recognize that there's essentially 2 kinds of homemakers in the United States. Most of them are people who only take a couple of years out of the paid workforce to be home with their kids. So that is one bucket of people, and they have special needs and considerations. Another is people who are in it for the long haul. And often these are moms with a bunch of kids. So if you only have 2 kids, the trend is you might take a couple of years out of the workforce, but then you'll go back to work once your youngest child hits kindergarten age, for example. Then there's another group who has, 4 or 5 or 6 children, and those women often just stay out of the workforce for many, many years, and they have different needs. But I do think that there is a real need to protect both classes, both groups of homemakers. Something that I don't write about, but which I think is very important, and other people have really excellent policy solutions for, is working on engaging men in family life to a greater degree. Being a stay-at-home mom, being a homemaking mom without a committed, engaged husband is, it's basically impossible. So you can't have a homemaker in a family without the other partner or spouse being really engaged in that family. And I think questions about the wages of working class men also are very important to this conversation. So that's sort of beyond what I write about, but I think critical.
Along these lines, there's something that you wrote about that I found so fascinating, which was in your discussion of what we call women who have dedicated themselves to this work that is not in the paid workforce. You wrote that housewife, which is the precursor to the word housewife, appeared as feudalism ended and farming families began to independently own small plots of land. During the 13th century, housewife denoted special social status as a woman who was part of a family that owned its own property and made its own decisions about how best to use it. And society came to recognize that these early housewives and husbands both had equally important roles to play in the marriage and the work of their small farms, which seems to me consistent with what you're saying in terms of a homemaker mother needs an engaged partner. There needs to be a partnership there, which is how the family for many centuries operated. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yes, it's so interesting to me that housewife by many modern feminists is sort of denigrated as a term of oppression. But when it originated as a term of liberation. So obviously, during feudalism, people were not in control of their own lives. Instead, how they lived was governed by the feudal system. As that system was crumbling and as the earliest forms of capitalism were created, we began to recognize that the women in these small holdings were special. They were independent. They were married to a husband, which at that time denoted the man who was working these small, independently owned farms. And then there was the housewife, who also had a special role to play. And throughout much of history, from the 1300s up until the Industrial Revolution, it was obvious to everybody that the role that housewives or homemakers played was indispensable to life. Because without them, you wouldn't eat and you would go naked because they were responsible largely for producing the food on the table and the clothing, in addition to raising the kids. Then we sort of lost that sense during the Industrial Revolution, although there was a real effort by American women such as Harriet Beecher Stowe, who you may remember, and her sister, Katharine Beecher, to professionalize the homemaker role, to say this still really matters. And that effort continued through to the 1920s and 1930s to say, look, even though we've had the Industrial Revolution, the role that women play at home is still extremely important. And then, as I've said, during the 60s and 70s, when women started moving into paid work, that went along with just a devaluation of the importance of this role. And I think it was sort of accompanied by this sense in the 50s that women were sort of infantile. It kind of is wrapped up in this same movement that, like, look, we as women are not going to be treated as children, got linked up with also there's nothing useful for women to do at home anymore. So they should be out in the paid workforce. And my opinion is we should certainly retain this objection to women being treated as children. It is absolutely right that women are entitled to full and equal rights in our society. That was always worth fighting for. It continues to be worth fighting for. But that we should reject this sense that there's nothing useful for women to do at home anymore. I think that that was just wrong. I mean, it seemed plausible at the time that we were going to have a technological revolution that rendered the work of the home unnecessary. But as it turns out, that was not correct. And that there still is very important work to do in caring for children at home, in caring for a family, and in caring for elderly relatives. And in addition, that we are really missing the community building role that women used to play. So all those tight social connections that we never saw, that were just sort of beneath the surface, a lot of that was created and tended to by homemakers who were hosting the church socials, who were doing the coffee hours, who were volunteering on the PTA, and who had the time to do that because they weren't participating in full-time paid work. And that social fabric is starting to unravel because it rested on the labor of homemakers. And we really miss that. When you look at social alienation today, when you look at the breakdown of community ties, a lot of that, I believe, is not due to iPhones or whatever else people are currently blaming it on. I think a lot of it is due to the fact that women no longer have the time to tend to those community ties in the way that they did before.
So you also have written about the same kind of progression from feudalism to sort of agency and independence today. You wrote, the feudalism to be rejected in 2023 America is not the archaic high Middle Ages system of serfdom, but its modern equivalent in working class families that are stuck in low paid shift work jobs with no time or money to feed their children anything better than McDonald's and Pop-Tarts. These are the families that dose their kids with Tylenol and send them to daycare because they have no work sick days left to use. These are the families that watch helplessly as broken community ties have destroyed the shields of family, religion, and neighborhoods that would formerly have served as bulwarks against the menaces of fentanyl, loneliness, alcoholism, the darkest recesses of the internet, and other causes of the modern deaths of despair. And if we just think of this, that the feudalism that has to be rejected now, the modern equivalent of that feudalism is working class families that are earning so little that they can barely keep it together. And the idea that one of them would be able to leave the workforce full-time or maybe even part-time is just completely out of the question for them. What are your thoughts on that?
So this is based on a series of interviews that I'm continuing to do with women who are homemakers. And so I talked with a woman who was a factory worker, and so was her husband. And they're great people. They're very dedicated, very hard workers. And so they both worked at the same factory. And when she had her first child, they started working split shifts. I forget who was working the overnight shift and who was working the daytime shift, but they started working split shifts so that their baby would always be with one of the parents. And they did this first because they just didn't want their baby in daycare. And then also daycare was really expensive. So they made that choice. But then when they had their second baby, they couldn't make it work anymore. It was just too hard. And also she was like, I hated it. So they decided to send their kids to daycare. They hated that more. She was like, that was awful. She was like, we are both working full time. We are both during the day now. But I pick the kids up from daycare, microwave some chicken nuggets, try to get the kids to eat those, often while watching TV, and then basically like put them to bed, and that was it. And she was like, that was awful. So they moved into the basement of her in-laws. And they live in a basement apartment so that she could be home with their kids and her husband could work in a manufacturing job. And he supports them with that. You know, he's getting promotions and getting pay raises. Because of the cost of housing in the area, they still can't afford to move out of the basement apartment they're in. But she's like, it is so much better. I actually get to see the kids, and I was not seeing the kids before. And so when I think about people who are pushing for paid childcare, who, as I've discussed, are mostly wealthy elites, for those people, their kids are going to be fine, mostly. You know, they can afford the nanny or they can afford the really fancy, expensive daycare. Their jobs are demanding, but often they are flexible around what you need to do. And so those people, it works for them. The people it doesn't work for are people who, like I said, are working class jobs, and they don't have access to the nannies. They don't have access to the really fancy daycares. And there is this sense that, okay, let's just provide them access to the fancy daycares. I just don't think that's practical. I don't think that's happening. And so for them, what their lives look like is both of them are struggling to work two jobs that they don't enjoy. They're feeding their kids junk. They don't want to be, but that's like what you have time for if you're working two full-time jobs. And they have some sick days, but they don't have enough. Kids get sick. And so, they can't tuck a sick kid up in bed with chicken noodle soup and ginger ale. They've got to give the kid some painkiller and hope for the best and send them to school. And that's awful. That feels awful as a mother. That feels awful as a father. And to say we're just going to fix that by providing better childcare, that is, in my opinion, a pipe dream.
So you referred to this earlier, but wages are really a key part of this, because what's standing in the way for many lower working class families is that neither one of them is earning enough to enable the other one to not be in paid work.
I agree. I mean, that is outside the scope of what I focus on. My friends at American Compass, which you may be familiar with, do a lot of great work in this area. There are people working on solutions to this problem. As someone who focuses on homemakers, what I can say is that there is a problem, that the work of homemakers is vitally important, but it is unpaid. And so the hand-in-hand problem with that is supporting the other parent to be able to make the money to support the homemaker. So C.S. Lewis famously, paraphrasing someone else, once said, and I'm not going to get it exactly right, but that the most important work is the work of the home, and all jobs exist to support that work. I think that's going a little too far, but I do think that the work of the home is critically important. And so when we think about that, we also need to think about how we support the people who support that work of the home. And it's sort of like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. You can't have it without both the peanut butter and the jelly. And so you need the homemaker, but you also need to think about the breadwinner. And so both parts of that conversation are very important. And so I talk about the homemaker, and I'm grateful that there are people out there who are talking about the breadwinner.
So my last question, do you think this fairly significant life shift over the last 2 or 3 years has changed you? And if so, how?
Yes, I think it has very much changed me. I think it is the best thing I've ever done, but it was very scary. And so you may know this, Katharine. I think when you go through our educational system, especially at elite levels, you sort of get pressed into a particular mold, a particular way of thinking. There's the right way and there's the wrong way, and you sort of have to walk down a path that people expect of you. And so it was very scary walking away from that path. A path which led to, by the way, financial security and social approval and all sorts of other good things. But I also think that the opportunity to be with my baby through now all 12 months of her infancy, it is so special, Katharine. There is nothing in my life that I will ever do that will ever be as meaningful and as special as that. There's just no words for it. And I homeschool my older children, and being able to learn with them and alongside them, in addition to being able to shape their learning, again, it is intellectually challenging, it is creative, and it is so meaningful. And, we have life insurance for my husband, and God forbid he should die. But if I have to go back to paid work one day because of family circumstances or a death or anything, that will be so sad. I mean, I would do it if I had to, but just the experience of being home with my kids, I could not have understood the difference until I had done it. I didn't know what I was missing with my older sons until I had it with my little girl. And like I said, I would never sit in judgment on another family. So this is in no way criticizing families where both parents work who've made different decisions than me. I would never say anything negative about that. But for me, like I said, this is the best thing I'll ever do. And I know it. I'm in it. And I'm like, this is the best thing you'll ever do, Ivana. These are the days. And they pass so quickly and you'll never get them back. And you're doing it. Which is not to say they're all amazing. Like right before I hopped on this podcast, the baby was just losing it over something. And the older kids were like, she's destroying our magnet tile castle, take her away. So it's not that every moment is smooth or easy, but they're all golden.
Well, Ivana, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for spending this time talking with me. I appreciate it hugely.
Oh, it's been an honor to be on this podcast. Thank you for inviting me, Katharine.
Thank you so much to Ivana for a wonderful conversation. And thanks to you, our listeners, for joining us today. Please subscribe to the podcast so you're always up to date. Check out CCFP's work at ccfp.org and follow us on Twitter @_CCFP and @KBStevens. We'll see you on the next episode of Early Matters.
You've been listening to Early Matters, the podcast on the science and policy of early childhood, produced by the Center on Child and Family Policy.